I had a lot of self-doubt. I had a lot of questions, how much value I'm able to add. And so the first 3 years here in the States, when I started my coaching business, were really, really hard on all levels, financially, emotionally.
Welcome to Coach as Entrepreneur. Today's guest is Urs Koenig, peacekeeper, ultra-endurance champion, and best-selling author on radical humility and leadership. Urs has inspired leaders at Amazon, Microsoft, and Starbucks with his powerful framework for leading with both strength and compassion. Urs, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I am too. We have kind of been actually in contact over the years through Marshall Goldsmith and Global Coach Group. But, we've never really gotten the chance to kind of dive into why and how did you become a coach?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
So I started coaching a long time ago when it was the Wild West in 2000. And, no ICF, no certification, no nothing. I transitioned out of an academic, an athletic, and the consulting background into coaching. And so, there's a longer story there, but the short version is that I looked back at all the various jobs I held before that. As I mentioned, an academic, so I would coach, mentor, supervise postgrad students. So I enjoyed the coaching element there. A cross-country skiing, a collegial cross-country skier in Switzerland. And when I got more senior on the team, I was coaching the younger skiers. So I was sort of learning the coaching element there. And then as a consultant, of course, after my MBA, there's a coaching element to a lot of what we do in consulting as well. So I sort of put all this together and looked at what's the common thread across all the different things I've done up to this point, and coaching sort of bubbled to the surface. And so that's how I transitioned in 2000 when I still lived in Australia to coaching.
So before you were coaching, because you were also, you're a UN peacekeeper, you have a very interesting background. Just a quick background on what you were doing before coaching as well, in terms of your UN background.
Absolutely. Well, actually, my UN background is much more recent, David.
Oh,
So I grew up in Switzerland and I studied geography of all things, and I pursued an academic career as a geographer. And in parallel to that, I was, as I mentioned, a collegiate level cross-country skier, and then transitioned into business. I went and did an MBA, did consulting, and then in 2000, I transitioned to coaching. Ever since, I have coached to varying degrees. Actually, right now, I'm coaching much less than I used to. In 2017, so what is that now? 9 years ago, I rejoined the military at age 50 and served as a NATO peacekeeper in the Balkans. And then in 2021, so 4 years ago, I went back and spent a year in the Middle East for the UN as a peacekeeper. So my UN work, my peacekeeping work is much more recent. So that's when I already worked as a coach beforehand.
usually,
You're
usually
right.
the timeline is different.
That's it. So, I wrote the book on humility, but, I am not, maybe in many ways, not exactly not usually in that way. But yeah, so the rejoining military at 50, I can tell you, David, that was the trip. That was quite something that taught me humility, that taught me a lot of different things. One of the things I love about going back into a structured environment like that as a coach, as a leadership consultant, as a speaker, is to actually live the life of my clients, right? It's always very easy for us as coaches, as consultants on the outside to sort of, coach people. Not always easy, but what should you be doing and how can I help you and whatnot. But then to go actually back into an org with matrix organizations, international force, and live the leadership world of my clients, it was super helpful. And I loved it on many levels, but not the least for the fact that put me back into hot water, as a consultant, as a coach, and I had to lead myself and do the stuff that I, preach otherwise.
Right. It's a little bit ironic to me sometimes when I think about it, because a lot of the coaches I talk to, almost all of the coaches I've spoken to, they all work for themselves as solopreneurs, as entrepreneurs, right? And so they're no longer in organizations, but they go in and they do the consulting, they do the coaching within an organization. And so you're doing the coaching and because you have that experience, but then it's been a while since you've actually experienced being under somebody else's leadership or really being a leader for other people.
Yeah, that's exactly. And we could talk more about my transition to coaching. So I was very much guilty, David, of, sort of imposter syndrome early on. Like, who am I anyway? Like, to be able to coach executives because, I never was a CEO. But exactly then going back and actually, into the military much later in my coaching career was very helpful indeed for the reasons you just outlined.
So one thing that's kind of come across for me is that, first time managers, I was actually just reading an article about somebody transitioning into management and how it's completely different from the work that they did before. So when you become a first time manager and a leader, like it can be difficult because you're not used to it. But for you going back into the UN as someone with that coaching experience, with the leadership experience, I would imagine you would have been a wonderful leader.
Well, you have to ask my subordinates. No, look, David, honestly, I live and breathe leadership. I love to write about it. I love to talk about it. I love to coach on it, and I love to live it. And by no means am I a perfect leader. And, in my book, I outline a lot of the leadership experiences I had going back for NATO and for the UN. But I do pride myself on, being a good student of leadership and then actually applying the concepts that I coach my clients on when I'm in leadership positions myself. But, obviously, like all of us, by no means do I not make mistakes. There's plenty of things I could have done better. But for sure, if I look at all the various aspects of my work for NATO and for the UN as a peacekeeper, the team leadership aspect I really love because there's a lot of other things. You have to read up on the politics. You need to understand the security situation on the ground. You need to be up on the military knowledge. But the leadership aspect I really loved.
I'm just curious because you have your subordinates, right? And in your role, did you kind of turn off your coaching brain or were you still kind of coaching your subordinates to be leaders as well?
The latter, absolutely. So, one of the measures of success in my book as a leader is how successful your team members are and become. In other words, I often talk about this concept of a leadership factory. My success as a leader is measured by how far my team members go. And so that is, for example, something, so mentoring, coaching, supporting, holding accountable to. So that's something that I very much was striving towards and was quite successful at. Actually, my team members were very successful and went places for sure. So absolutely did I always have my coaching hat on, David, but at the same time, also understanding that I'm not their coach, I'm their boss. And these are two different things. I can apply coaching skills as a leader, but I'm not their coach. And so I have an agenda as their boss. And, I had to make some very tough calls. I had to let two people go, actually. And so as a coach, you don't do that, right? I mean, I guess you can, well, actually, that's not true. We fire clients too. But I don't have to fire people from their workplace as a coach. And I certainly had to do that as well.
So it sounds like, looking through your LinkedIn biography, looking at your timeline, you've had a very interesting life. I feel like your military background, but also you being an ultra endurance athlete, how do those things inform your coaching style? Right. Or maybe they don't
necessarily inform my coaching style. I think, if I compare myself to my colleagues, other coaches, I am definitely a no nonsense coach. So in other words, of course, I just did my recertification through the ICF. Like I am good at, all the technical stuff, like the paraphrasing, the empathizing, the being present with the client, the coaching presence, as we call it. I'm certainly able to do that. And I'm also very outcome driven. So clients who are stuck for a long time are not great fits for me. And so the ultra endurance, the military, if you think about it, is sort of results driven and no nonsense to some extent. And so that certainly comes through in my coaching style. And I've made some mistakes, to be very clear, David. I mean, I think it's one of my strengths. It's one of my keys to strength. In fact, we can talk about ideal clients and why they gravitate towards me. But I've also overstepped. I've also been too direct and gotten into hot water with some clients. So I don't necessarily think that the ultra endurance and the military informs my coaching style, but it's more sort of what makes up my personality and then in turn my coaching style as well.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So, since you opened up that door talking about your ideal client, how did you figure out who your ideal client was? Was it from like day one, I became a coach and here's my ideal client? Or was it, a 10-year journey? How was that for you?
So I know you obviously talk to a lot of coaches, David. So anybody who's claiming they know their ideal clients on day one is full of you know what, right? So let's be very clear, very, very crystal clear. Nobody knows that. And it's evolving
Yeah.
constantly, right? So we're all work in progress. So absolutely not. I'm just telling you, a ideal client profile for me is actually, and I'm saying it a bit flip here, David, it's the arrogant jerk. And it's often a male, aggressive, results driven. We all know these people, right?
Hmm.
No prisoners taken. It's very smart, very analytical, not much time for team dynamics or don't suffer fools lightly. And because of my background, as we mentioned in ultra endurance and the military, I can sort of meet these clients at eye level. And then
Yeah.
I'm able to, at the best, not always, but at the best of times, I'm able to help them to sort of come around and say, you know what? There's actually a cost to my team. There's a cost to me for how I show up, right? And so,
Hmm.
so that is actually my ideal client, a bit of a bull in a china shop sort of
Mm.
scenario. That is, I'm being very blunt here. I'm sorry, but that's how I roll. And so that's my ideal client. And another ideal client is actually somebody who needs a lot of accountability. So
Hmm.
somebody who needs help in sort of getting off their behind and getting stuff done. So I'm a strong accountability partner. But to come back to your question, on day one, my coaching evolved. When I first started to coach, I did career coaching. And I started as a career coach and then transitioned into small business, like entrepreneurial coaching, and then started into executive coaching only about 6 years into my coaching. And that's been the bulk, though, of my work as a coach has been in leadership and executive coaching, but by no means did I start there.
When you started, did you think you knew who your client was going to be, or you were just kind of just open and just trying anything and everything?
Well, a bit of both. And I think that's actually, when we're talking about advice for new coach, I think we need to run it on two parallel paths. On the one hand, always thinking about what resonates. Who do I resonate with? And more importantly, like who's drawn to me? Like who do I work best with? And so really paying attention to when we're working with different clients, where the sweet spot is. So that needs to happen. At the
Mm.
same time, I believe when we're first starting out coaching, we just need to give it away and do it for everybody. Just like get off your butt and just do it and give it away for
Yeah.
free. And I certainly did that and try a lot of different things. Only by trying a lot of different clients, a lot of different client scenarios, and of course, all within the realm of being sensible and within the boundaries of what we're actually supposed to do as a coach. Within those boundaries, of course, try everything and then really pay attention to who you resonate with and who is sort of drawn to you. And then, those things will crystallize, but they only crystallize over time if we actually do them and try them out.
That also applies to just like running your business, right? Not just
Right.
the client, but also with the marketing, the creating visibility and awareness for yourself. Find it like more and more often that I realize a lot of people just have a fear of kind of putting themselves out there and just talking about what they do. So for you, you're able to kind of just overcome and just get out there.
Oh, well, yeah, but that was hard too. So remember, it's 2000. To do two things, I had to explain what coaching is because nobody knew what coaching was, right? So explain what
Right.
coaching is, number one, and then number two, sell me. So I had to sell. It is still to some extent, it's still true. But today, like especially in the leadership executive arena, as you know, like HR
Yeah.
understands what an executive coach can do in general, right? And so we don't
Right.
have to fight that uphill battle anymore. But I had a lot of self-doubt. I had a lot of questions, how much value I'm able to add. And the first 3 years, I also underwent a lot of personal transitions. So I moved from Australia to the States, so different continent. I changed careers. So I left my consulting job and decided to start my coaching business. And I was in a new
Hmm.
relationship. So three major life changes all at once. Like every new
Yeah.
business, it always takes longer, it always costs more. And so the first 3 years here in the States, when I started my coaching business, were really, really hard on all levels, financially, emotionally, also intellectually. And so, these were the days of Thomas Leonard and Coach Hugh, and we're doing, classes on the telephone, on the landline and whatnot. And so it really was a different time. But no, I certainly worked hard on getting out there. And one of the best things I've actually did was to, maybe I told you this earlier, I can't remember, sublet an office space here in Seattle in one of the business districts. So I got out of the house, out of my home, into the community, and to your point earlier about being out there, and that physically, this was before the internet, pretty much, that made a lot of difference in my business. I ended up coaching a lot of the people I would run into on a daily basis in our office, actually, because they're all small business owners. So anyway, that was one of the things that really helped me.
Yeah. Well, because I was going to ask, because so many coaches, when they start out, their advice is go to your network, find referrals, and do that. But if you're transplanting from Australia to the US, you have no network.
It was a really dumb thing to do. Well, or dumb, it was just overambitious, right? I mean, because the smart thing to do is exactly what you're saying, go part-time in your job and start, in your network, all the rest of it. So no, I had to build up everything from scratch, and it was really tough.
I can't imagine like new home, new country, not even new home, new country, new career, and new relationship. I imagine there's a lot of stress. Did you have anybody, any mentors, any other coaches around you that were helping you through that, like with all of it?
Absolutely. I mean, so I'm a huge believer in, if we're a coach, then we better have a coach ourselves. And so as I transitioned from Australia to the States, I started with a small business coach in Australia. His name is Robert Garish. I think still does a bit of coaching. And then as I got more settled in the States, I worked with Molly Gordon, who was a local chair. And then over the years, worked with a bunch of different coaches. To this day, I have a coach. I just actually spoke to my coach yesterday. And so, but certainly through that early transition, I basically looked for people who were 5 years ahead of me, maybe, so who started even earlier, and worked with them. And that helped me tremendously.
I didn't realize it before I started doing this podcast, but that's probably the number one piece of advice that coaches have is if you're a coach, you should have a coach. And it, yeah, makes 100% sense. So I'm curious, as you've kind of gone through the spectrum of different types of coaching and different types of coaching clients, what have you seen, and you've been doing it since the 2000s, how has the coaching industry changed in your perspective in the last 2 decades?
Well, I think overall it's become probably too obvious to state, but more sophisticated. And so it's become somewhat, well, no, actually, I'm not sure. Well, there is, some more legal boundaries about it, but certainly more sophisticated and more accepted in not just the business environment in terms of business and executive coaching, but like in the wider world. And so not always been a huge fan of the ICF, but I do applaud the ICF for the work that they're doing around certifying coaches, around making sure that professional standards are upheld. So that's what I see, like any other industries, it's sort of just maturing in a good way. I really feel that way.
A question I was asked yesterday too was the median age of coaches. As I've seen that number kind of start to drop, like the average age of a coach. What have you noticed?
That's a great question. I don't have actually data on that. Is there data that shows that, or
I don't know if there's data,
anecdotal?
anecdotal, like from my personal observations, because I was working with all the certifications, and so
Yeah.
with the coaches coming through certifications, I just noticed like when I started, when I was coming closer, to now, that age started with like people who were in their 50s. In my observation, it looks like it's dropping, that age.
Well, and so if you think about it, in line with what I said earlier, that it's maturing as a profession, that would make sense because in the old days, and I was, of course, the exception because I was relatively young when I started. In the old days, it was you needed to be in your 50s and either a psychology background or must have been a CEO, and then you can be an executive coach, right? And so, and this was sort of the semi-retirement gig. And of course, you have people like
Right.
Marshall, like exceptions who come from academia. But now, as it's really more established as a profession, there certainly makes sense that younger people are pursuing it as well because it's like anything else. You can really learn it, and you don't actually have. It helps to have the background. It helps to have the experience. But like in sports, as you well know, you don't have to be a star quarterback in order to be a great coach. You can actually coach without ever having been an NFL player yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The experience helps, but you can also just be a really great coach.
Yeah.
So, my question for you now is through your long experience as a coach, what have you found to be the most rewarding part of the work that you've been doing?
I think the most rewarding, it was the same at the beginning as it is now, is seeing a client go through a really meaningful personal transformation. And so being a part of a client's transformation, whatever that might be, that could be, and I often, by the way, this is a quick aside, David, when I think about what coaching is, I like to keep it really simple. It's two things. It's a new insight. I look at different lens. I look at a problem through a different lens in a different way, and I take action. I do something differently. So a new insight and an action. And so helping a client, being a catalyst, being a supporter, being a coach of a client transformation, like that to this day is, I love that. That is so cool. And then having the client shine, like I'm the coach, right? And you and I know this, of course, like we're in the background. We don't need the spotlight, but having the client go on and shine, I absolutely love that. What I always loved about specifically executive coaching, it's at the intersection of deep, meaningful, personal work, personal transformation, and interesting business problems. So I love the fact that, of course, we're not consultants, but we need to understand the context of the client's work, his or her work environment. So this intersection of interesting business problems and deep personal transformation, I absolutely love that. And so I find that most satisfying to this day.
Can you give us a little bit of an example or story of somebody that you helped through a transformation? Obviously, you don't need to give their names, but just kind of explain the scenario.
So I have in line with what I said earlier about the ideal client, I have a number of clients that come to mind. One was in high tech, the other one was in an outdoor retailer. And as I think about it, they were both in branding, online marketing, and as I mentioned, uber smart, very driven, don't suffer fools lightly, left a big wake behind them and a lot of damage with their team. And so helping them with the help of 360s, and I do a lot of shadow coaching. So I sit in the back of the room during the client's meetings or whatever and sort of just observe what's going on, helping them to gain an appreciation for the impact that some of their behavior is having on their team members. This takes a lot of time, but they're smart people. When I present them with data, when I present them with hard feedback, they were able to really take that in, and not everybody is. And the biggest reward out of all of this, David, is both of these clients I'm thinking about, and this is not about my ego, but they to this day say the work we did together, 10 years ago, like that has been transformative for my career, because they both have gone on to bigger and better jobs now at the C-level. And one of them, the other one I don't know, one of them I know, his family, his wife and his kids have also commented on how he is showing up differently at home. So the sort of the spillover effect, I know Marshall talks about this as well, the spillover effect from how I'm showing up at work because of our coaching together into the family. Like, these are two examples of people that come to mind where I really felt like that was a great engagement and they did exactly what they wanted and needed to do. And it helped them, they didn't just do it because it was the right thing to do. It actually helped them to be more successful, both professionally, went on to bigger and better things, but also at home and personally. So those are two things that come to mind here.
So I have a question in that the things that you were working on, were they things that other people saw in them and they just didn't believe? Or did they have this belief that because of this thing, I am successful?
Are you asking the difference between because and despite behaviors? Or what are you asking?
I'm trying to understand. So maybe it's the same thing. The question, one is, did they believe that whatever issues that they had that you were working on, it was because of those behaviors that they were successful?
Well, yes and no, right? I mean, I think you're getting at this. Well, if I'm less of a jerk, then they won't respect me, right? So I need to yell at them. Is that what that's what often happens, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the truth is, because we were working on this. I mean, we talked about, literally, I was quoting Marshall, them, what got you here won't get you there. Understand the difference between the because behaviors and the despite behaviors. Subconsciously, I think they absolutely know, because subconsciously they absolutely thought they needed to show up that way in order to be successful. But we needed to lift it out of the subconscious into the conscious and really look at it. And because they're smart and rational, they then could see that actually didn't make sense. So they don't actually have to yell at their team members for team members to do what they asked them to do.
Okay. So then, like through the 360s, you had the data that said, actually, this is a problem.
And they had, I mean, the best data is the turnover in their team. You just look, that's a number. It's a metrics. Turnover in your team. I mean, that's the best in my book. And then 360 is a close second. And, they were competitive. So we can benchmark them against other people, and whatnot. And so absolutely. And then also, as we started to develop trust and they started to trust me more as a coach, my feedback based on the shadow coaching also was data that they could trust. So sort of a bunch of different things.
And then the other question I had was, those behaviors, because you said there was an impact on their lives at home. I think people think they can compartmentalize much better than they really can. And so were the behaviors that they were doing in the office, were they carrying that over into the home? And so as they got better in the office, they were what was going on?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And by the way, it's total BS. Oh, I'm a different person at home. Like, come on. So to some extent, maybe, but I actually make it a rule when I do my 360 interviews. They don't have to, but I ask politely, can I also talk to your spouse? And not everybody is on board. Most people actually are. And so I get a sort of insight a little bit into what's going on at home. But you're exactly right. I mean, the behavior that was not helpful at work, with maybe a few edges taken off, also showed up at home, no question. I think you're exactly right. It's very, very hard for us to be two different people at work and at home.
Yeah. So that's what draws me to these stories of like coaching, like these case studies, right? Because the work that coaches do in the office doesn't just impact the business and that business leader, right? It's more holistic than that because it also changes them holistically. And so when they're outside of that office space, they take those changes, that growth, that transformation into their personal lives. And so you're improving the business, right? You're seeing better metrics, you're seeing better numbers, most likely not just in retention, but also in, productivity and your bottom line, right? But also in the home or in your personal relationships. And that's what I love about coaching because it's changing people for the better.
I mean, I often talk about it, like better leaders, better world, right? I mean, it's a bit grandiose, but we can really make a difference in the world for exactly the reasons you're mentioning. Then we show up. I mean, I experienced this myself as a client as well, right? So when I'm being coached on something that's hard at work, and then maybe I show up with some not very constructive behaviors at work, most likely I also display them at home. And so it makes a difference at home as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a story that Chris Coffey used to tell about where he was working with a leader and the leader was saying, he was a complete jerk in the office. Very similar to the leaders you're describing. And he asked that leader, do you think you act like this at home? He's like, no, never. And so it's like, let's call your family and ask. They got on the phone, they called, and his wife laughed at him. He's like, that's exactly how you act at home. And then he's like, should we call your kids? And he's like, yeah, let's call my kids. Same thing. And so it was that point when he realized, not for the office, but for my family, I got to change. And so
That's a great story. And I have something similar, actually, if I may quickly, David. So I had a client who I did a 360 with, and you know how we always tell our clients, don't guess who said what, right? Don't guess who in the qualitative, in the open-ended questions, who said what. And they still do. And she was convinced that this one comment that was in there, which was very critical, came from this one guy at the office who, hated her and she didn't get along with him, and it was from her husband. The comment was from, exactly. And so it was a very critical, but it was a constructive comment. And so the point is exactly the same that, that Chris, or that you're making about Chris's story. It's very hard for us to be different people, and we carry our behaviors across home and work, no question.
It's funny because we tell ourselves these stories of ourselves in the workplace or at home, or even like what my business will be or who should be my ideal client.
Right, right.
And you never really know until you actually look at the information or you test it and actually try it out, especially when it comes to like the business side of things. Until you go out and start working with clients, you don't know who you actually want to work with because you have a imaginary picture of this would be the perfect client. And then when you start working with them, reality hits.
I think that's exactly right. Right on. And that's why I tell any new coach, try everything at least once, and then see
Mhm.
what works for you. Absolutely.
For you, when you started your business, right, as a coach, did you think it was going to be kind of this grandiose thing, or were you expecting like the 3 year, like kind of trial of growing little by little?
I certainly didn't think it would be a grandiose thing, but I also underestimated how hard it would be, to be honest. So
Mhm.
I felt somewhere in the middle. And so I thought that I would be faster at the point of break even and making decent money than I end up being. But I also didn't have any illusions. I mean, I wrote
Mm.
the business plan like we did back then, but I was pretty realistic actually about, what's doable and what's not doable. So, yeah.
So for you now, what does your coaching business look like, or what does your business look like?
So, as we talked earlier, I don't do much coaching at the moment. I primarily speak. I'm still
Mhm.
in leadership development. As I said, I dig anything related to leadership. I'm still very much drawn to sort of the behavioral leadership development, including coaching that I did for years. So now I am very selective because I primarily speak when I look at coaching and clients. And interestingly enough, so I did, as you know, for years, I did the Marshall Goldsmith stakeholder centered, like that's all I did. And I really believe in the approach, the systems approach, the getting the whole team on board, the shaping perceptions through
Yeah.
the regular check-ins, all the stuff that, I drank the Kool-Aid big time from Frank and Chris over the years, no question about it. So I do a little bit of that, but most of my coaching actually now, and as I said, it's not very much because I primarily speak. Most of my coaching right now is former clients coming back,
Mm.
wanting to work through a career transition. And I'm getting up there in age. I'm 58, so a lot of my clients or former clients are sort of, late 40s, early 50s, sort of a bit of a midlife thing. So what's next? I've
Okay.
risen up to this level, and so what do I want to do with the second last or the last portion of my working life, and how can I really have the most impact? So a lot of my coaching clients right now are actually sort of in that boat. So very different from what I used to do for years. So that's where things are
Mhm.
at the moment.
How did you move from doing the coaching and writing your book to doing the speaking now?
As you know, a lot of coaches also speak. So over the years, I've done, a bit of speaking here and there. I've done a lot of facilitation. That was one of the core elements of me building my business, was to become a CEO peer group facilitator. So I did Vistage chairing for a while, and I facilitated other industry specific CEO groups. And that really, like, that hockey stick my coaching business, because obviously I then could source individual clients out of these groups. And so that was I love doing it. I'm good at it. And it was very good for my business. But when I went back,
Can I ask a quick question?
absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah.
How did you get into working with those groups?
So this was one of those things where I went to like a local ICF chapter meeting here in Seattle, like on a Wednesday night at
Okay.
somebody's house, literally. And it was three other people there and me. And I met this
Okay.
wonderful other coach who's now becoming a dear friend, and I actually partnered with her for a while. And she was part of our organization that put on these CEO peer groups, and so she hired me. So we developed a relationship, and then
Yeah.
and so because I went to this random ICF chapter meeting at somebody's house on a Wednesday night at 5:30. The point is, like, you got to get out there. You never know what's going to
Yeah.
stick. And then because I did
Sure.
that, then I was able to apply to Vistage, because that's pretty competitive with Vistage, and so and do that. Okay, well, and now I lost my train of thought. What was the other thing you asked me about?
So the question was like, how did you get into the speaking?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So I coached up until 2017. Like, that was my thing full time. I did a bit of speaking, but I was a coach who occasionally spoke. And then in 2017, I rejoined the military, as I mentioned, for
Yeah.
NATO, and I was in the Balkans for 9 months. And then as part of that, I sort of took a step back, obviously, like figuratively and metaphorically, and looked at my coaching, my business, my career, my work life. And quite frankly, David, it's probably the wrong thing to say on your podcast, but I was getting a little bit bored with coaching. I'm like, I've done it for 17 years at this point. Like, I got this nailed, I got it down. So what else can I do? And I love
Right.
the leadership lane. And so then I decided, coming out of that mission, that I'm going to give this speaking thing a go. Let's actually study the speaking business, much like I did with the coaching, understand how speeches are sold, how they're bought, how agents play into it, what good stagecraft looks like, what's good marketing and sales, but all the stuff that we need to do in our coaching as well. And then between 2018, when I came back, and 2020, when I deployed on my next mission, I was really sort of laying the groundwork for my speaking business. And then when I came back from my second mission in 21, then I decided to write a book in order to really jumpstart my speaking business. And that's exactly what happened. So I published a book, which did very well indeed. Frank Wagner, by the way, wrote me a very nice testimonial among some other people. Since then, I've really been focusing on speaking.
I think that's a very natural progression that I've seen before in other leaders and other coaches' lives, right? Where you do coaching, facilitation, maybe you do the group coaching, and then either you start doing like courses or bigger groups, and then going to more speaking engagements. So is your business, the way you design your business for your coaching and now for speaking, is it pretty similar in terms of your day-to-day stuff, and then it's just you're doing more speaking? Or is it just different the way you do the business development and marketing?
Oh, well, okay. So a couple of things. How I spend my days is very different, because when I used to do coaching, we do also pre-COVID, of course, lots of face-to-face meetings. I would drive all over town and meet people face-to-face. And so when I coached full-time, my days were taken up with back-to-back coaching meetings, right? And so we have coaching sessions. And that I don't have now. And I spent very little, frankly, on thought leadership. Of course, I read on what's going on and I kept myself informed, but I really wasn't like I'm now a student of leadership, because now I need to develop content as a speaker, right? And so that's where the days are different now. I have fewer meetings, but I spend way more time on research, on developing new content, on practicing new content. And then instead of having back-to-back meetings, I might only speak once, maybe twice a week. Maybe I don't speak for 2 weeks, but then I speak, in 1 week twice. And so is more flying, more travel, but less day-to-day meetings. And it sort of comes in shorter spurt now, the work. And then it's sort of quiet again, where I really have to work on my craft, the presentation skills, and the thought leadership.
Do you find that you're the way you set up, because we're talking about visibility and awareness, right? So people need to know you and know you're credible, to have seen you speak. How do they reach out to you? Do they come in through your website, a lead magnet? They get into a database and kind of go through the kind of typical marketing funnel, or how does that work for you?
There's two overall channels. One is speakers bureaus, so agents. I am represented by, I don't know, maybe these speakers bureaus. That sounds grandiose, but you're on their site, and if you're lucky, an agent really has you in mind and pitches you regularly. So that's one channel, through speakers bureaus and agents. And the other channel is direct. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's how you and I connected as well again. So I get inbound stuff through LinkedIn, through my book. So I get a number of inbound inquiries through the book. And then, they do funnel, in terms of technical terms, they do funnel through the website. But it's basically through agents and then direct, and the outbound is the book. And then, by the way, every single speech needs to lead to another speech. That is my goal, at least. And so this is the same when you're thinking about coaching clients. Every client needs to lead to a referral. And so that needs to be the goal. And we can't force it, of course, but I measure my success on stage by how many referrals I get from that particular speaking engagement. And maybe it takes 3 years for something to come in. but that is my goal. So it needs to be the case that somebody walks away from my speech and going, we got to get this guy to my team. So that's the idea. And similarly, when we're thinking about, and I'm talking about coaching business here, showing up in a way and detaching them from the outcome, which is important, but showing up in a way as a coach with my client that they absolutely have to tell their best friend how helpful the work is that you do together. And then you have to detach as a coach, right? You can't get attached to the outcome because that is very unhealthy indeed. But
Right.
show up in a way that they have to tell their best friend at work, at home, how incredible, valuable the work is that you do together.
Yeah, that should always be our goal, right? We want to be excellent at what we do, or else kind of what's the point of the work, right?
Yeah,
If you're
yeah,
not,
yeah.
I love that because there's a lot of practical things that we've talked about in terms of the coaching, but also your business of coaching, right? Being in a co-working space where you can just talk to people, it puts you out into a space where you can network if you take advantage of it and get to know people and build relationships using speaker bureaus and networking through partnership programs, connecting with other coaches and building relationships and friendships to do projects together. And then the point about every coaching engagement, every speaking should at least line itself up to you getting another job afterwards. I think that perspective is hugely important because I feel like sometimes people, even like when it comes to like emails or just content, it's just like, I'm just throwing it out there and we'll just see without any intention to what's the next thing. And that's so important.
We call it the CTA. What's the call to action? And let's not be shy. A lot of coaches are shy. Unlike car salespeople, right? A lot of coaches are shy in selling themselves, right? And it's uncomfortable. Like you're not selling a crappy car, you sell yourself. And that's scary. I get it.
Yeah.
It's vulnerable, it's difficult, but we gotta have, to your point, what's the call to action? What's the next step? I mean, I'm not a salesperson. I'm not a sales specialist, but sales is really, if I can help you to achieve your goal, then it's not sales. Like I'm helping you in a transformation. So that's very genuine.
And I think there's also a lot of coaches, a lot of people in general, when you get inundated, like the used car salesman, you see that you're like, I never want to be that person, so I don't want to do sales. Or you get the emails and you feel they're so spammy that you're like, I never signed up for this. Why am I getting these emails? I don't want to do that. And so there's this, you see all of it and you're like, these are all the things I don't want to be associated with. And so a lot of coaches just decide not to do any of it.
Right.
But how do you build your business like that? And so, instead of thinking of it as sales or like marketing, the coaches I've spoken to, I'm like, instead of marketing, think of it as a relationship. You're there to not connect with everybody. You're just trying to find a few people and build real connections and relationships with. Unless you are being genuine and building a relationship with them, they're not going to trust you with their money and want to work with you as a coach.
Right.
And so that's kind of that perspective for the creating content or emails. It's connecting with a friend, telling them your insights, providing value to try to help them with the things that you've learned and insights that could help them in their daily life, right?
I think that's exactly right. Thinking of it as a relationship where you can add value. And then I have to also say, though, David, so that's all true, but sometimes coaches need to just get out of their own way. Like you got to actually close the deal at one stage. You got to actually say, okay, this is going to be $30,000 and like that's the deliverable. And so you got to actually ask for the sale at one stage. And so it still is a business we're building. And if you don't want to build a business, then give it away, right? So I think there is and I've had hang-ups.
There's a fine line.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Well said. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. You just have to be able to be vulnerable and accept rejection if it comes, but you're never going to move forward unless you put yourself out there to ask the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And we better that's the one thing I would say. Don't go into coaching as a solopreneur, like you mentioned, a lot of the people you talked to on this podcast also. Don't do it if you can't handle rejection. I'm sorry. A lot of people will say no to you. You will ask a lot of times, and for whatever reasons, it won't work. And it's not fun. It's certainly not easy at the beginning when we're just building our business, but it's sort of part of small business ownership. And so otherwise, we can also coach internally. Maybe you're interviewing some internal coaches on this podcast as well, which actually would be interesting.
Mostly it's external. Well, I should try to look for some internal coaches. The rejection part, and if you're not willing to accept that, that's huge. So that's the thing is most coaches don't get into coaching
Yeah.
to build a business.
No,
They
that's
do
right.
it because they want to
They want to
coach.
help. They want to help. They want to support. Exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes.
But you only can coach for as long as you can feed yourself, and so you need
Right.
to make the money.
Exactly right. The funny thing is, David, towards the end of my coaching career, this is a little bit of an embarrassing admission on my part, but I actually got more excited about the sales process. Like, can I land this sucker? And then I
Hmm.
landed it, and I go, oh, damn, now I have to do the work. So this was late in the game, to be honest, and that was a sign,
Yeah.
quite frankly, to me as well, where I said, you know what? I think I'm getting a bit burned out or bored with it, so maybe I should look at something else. So that's what
Yeah.
happened to me. I sort of loved the chase, and then I got the work. I'm like, I have to coach. Probably a terrible
So
admission on this podcast.
no, but it is real. Like we go through our different stages and
Yeah,
we grow and we develop, and there's nothing that says you have to be a coach forever.
right.
And there's nothing that says like, yeah, why can't you change? Why can't you do something different? I
Yeah,
think that is perfectly normal and want to do more, right?
right.
Some people want to just coach, and some people after a while will say, I've done this for 20 years. I want to do more impact. I want to change and reach more people, right?
Right.
And I think that's what you're doing, right,
Yeah,
with your speaking.
yeah.
Before we close, I like to end with two questions. The first question is, what have you learned about yourself through this process of, becoming a coach?
I've learned that the business of coaching can be very lonely, and that's very hard for me. Because I am a solopreneur, I was in a partnership for a while. The fact that some days the only people I talk to are my clients and maybe a vendor or two, and that's it. So not having a team. So that is
Yeah.
very, very difficult for me. And so I think that's one of the things as people think about going into coaching, being awareness around, yes, you gain a lot of autonomy, call your own shots, all the good stuff, the independence, but it can be very, very lonely indeed. And so that is one thing I've learned, and it continues to be, quite honestly, it continues to be a struggle for me. So I have to manage it. We have to do all the networking, the networks you talked about earlier. This is also part of why I do these missions, because I'm back a part of a contingent of a team. So it sort of fills that need. So anyway, that's one thing I've learned.
The last question is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to somebody who's just beginning their coaching practice today?
Get the reps in. Give it away for free. Coach, coach, coach. Don't just informally over coffee make it a coaching contract, but it doesn't matter if you get paid or not. Get the reps in. Coach as much as you can and spend less time thinking about who your ideal client is and more time actually practicing coaching with different people that will give you the data to then actually make a better decision of who your ideal client is. So that's many other things come to mind, but that is maybe the one big thing. Like, let's get off our behinds and let's actually go out there and coach.
Urs, thank you so much. I really appreciated your time today and this interview. Yeah, this was just a fantastic conversation.
Thanks for having me. I loved it, David. Thanks so much.
Right. Before we close, how can people get in contact with you if they wanted to reach out?
So, as I mentioned, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So, LinkedIn, my name, Urs König, or my website, Urs König. I assume you put this in the show notes as well, urskoenig.com. So, either through LinkedIn or my website is the best way to reach me. Or, of course, buy my book.
Okay, perfect. Urs, thank you again. I really appreciated this conversation. Have a good day.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.